Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining my AMAP Friday. So, question I was asked was, what makes a person an expert in Pilates? So that's a very loaded question, I think, in many ways. Hi, Nadia. So I think that it's something that we need to sort of go through a few things. I mean, because I know that there's plenty of people out there that are saying that they're experts. And what does that mean? Because it's kind of like a generic term like Pilates or classical Pilates. Anybody can say they do it. Anybody can say that they're an expert at it, and there's nobody to say one way or the other. So what does it really take? Hi, Judy, Alexandra, Ellen. So, what does that take? I think it takes a number of things. One of the questions is, is it how much time, right? I have seen, I've been doing teacher training and training people and helping train people for, hi Frida, almost, let's see now, since 92. So it's been a while. Right. And I've seen this from the very beginning, people that, got certified and within, 6 months or a year were out doing trainings like they were experts. And that happened a couple times, not often, but it did happen because, it's kind of reminds me of my teenage children who thought they knew everything at a certain age. And now I have conversations with them and they're like, I don't hardly know anything. And I understand that, right? I get that as well. I definitely feel that aspect of it because, the older you get and the more you learn you don't know what you think you knew before. And there's so much information, right? So, it's a matter of time. And I think, how do you get intuition? Intuition is by doing the work, practicing the work, and, seeing so many different variables and remembering those things and putting that into your, into the toolbox. And when that happens, I think what you get is you get a basic understanding of commonalities, right? We're all the same and we're all different. So, we teach you, or you should be taught at least, what's the standard and what's the progression and how things, the exercises and how they work and all of those understandings of the process. And then, by doing it and seeing it, you start to see similarities. I mean, everybody's different, but there's more and more similarities. So over time, and, somebody walks in and you see that body type, you see that issue, you see that, imbalance, and you're trying to get them within their best balance, right? Balance is a fallacy, so it's really about finding the best balance within the imbalance. And if that's the case, after a while, somebody walks in and they're like, how do you know that? Well, it's because I've seen it before. That's your intuition. And so that sort of, to me, is partly, how you become an expert, because it's not what you say, because there's plenty of people who say they're experts. It's really what other people say, and it's how they interpret what you do and how you interact with them and how you teach them that makes you the expert, because you're able to do those things. I remember I went to go study yoga in India with BKS Iyengar after PT school. And somebody's like, was he any good? And he'd been teaching already for 40 or more years. And of course, but did we have issues? Yeah, I was a dancer and, I was very imbalanced, and he would come up and, people get upset, but, he'd come up and slap me and, have arguments with his, daughter, and she'd have to explain why, there was some issues there. But, we can't do that today. Maybe they do. I don't know. In yoga, we don't do that in Pilates, at least not, and I don't, that I know of. Anyways, so there's that, right? There's the time. Right. And then, some people, it's like, well, do you have to be a mover, a professional mover? And, that's, a lot of Pilates teachers are ex-dancers. A lot of the students that became first generation teachers were also ex-dancers. But that was not necessarily because Joe picked them because they were ex-dancers. It was because they could come to the studio, and if they started to help, they could work out and not have to pay. And, as dancers, always, you're at the low scale of income. Unless you get to, like Baryshnikov. Okay, yes, but the majority is very low pay, especially if you're a modern dancer in a small modern company. I remember I made 5 times as much money my first year as a physical therapist than I ever made as a professional dancer. So it says a lot, right? Anyway, so but do dancers, and movers, ice skaters, acrobats, gymnasts, what do they do, right? Their whole activity is looking at movement, reproducing that movement, and trying to get it, fine-tuned. And what do we do in Pilates teaching? Something very similar, right? So, do they make good teachers? Yeah, that usually. But again, it's personality. It's many other things. So, that doesn't necessarily mean that, you're going to be, if you're an ex-mover, that you can be you're always going to be an expert at Pilates. You have to do a lot more than that, right? You have to know the work. You have to study it. You have to understand the system. You have to understand the body. And yes, you have a tendency to have that if you were a mover, for sure. But I'm always more impressed when I see somebody who wasn't a dancer or a mover, an acrobat or a gymnast or ice skater, who then becomes a Pilates person, and they get it in their body, which is amazing because, a dancer comes to Pilates or an acrobat or a gymnast, right? And what have they done? They've spent the last 10, 20 years working on their strength and their flexibility and all these other things. Not necessarily in the Pilates way. Usually it's very imbalanced because, as I always say, people don't pay to see normal. And that's in gymnasts, that's in ice skating, and that's in dance, and that's in acrobats. They're doing very abnormal things to the body. I spent my career as a physical therapist helping those people that do those things undo and take care of their problems and injuries and issues, right? So that's another issue right there. But they still spend their time. So their brain is organized that way. So when you get somebody that wasn't organized that way and was a business person or an artist or this or that then becomes a Pilates teacher and starts to get into that, and they start to see and train and be able to do it as well, if not better, just as well, if not better than the professional mover, I'm much more impressed because that's a lot more time, energy, and effort and work that has to happen. But it's also interesting because it's really, the gestalt of understanding everything in Pilates is, I think, usually a little bit better for those people, but not always. Again, always depends on personality as well, right? So does the mover make it? No, I don't think it does. Okay, and then there's also body type. Do you have the right body for being do you have to have a certain kind of body to be able to be a Pilates teacher, an expert? And what's that mean? Anybody can be a Pilates teacher. Anybody, especially in today's world, right? Because all you have to do is say, I'm a Pilates teacher. And you can teach anything you want, and you're a Pilates teacher, because that's the reality. That's Pilates today. I see people saying, Pilates is this, is Pilates, and they're trying to define it, and that's no longer definable, right? It's just something that can't be done because it's just a generic term. So anybody can do that, and so if that's the case, where does that take us, right? So when we're looking at the person and who's doing it, and can they do the exercise, and do they have it in their bodies? Do they have a certain body type? And I've always said, Pilates, it's not about fat, it's about function. I've had very tall, very small, big, but wide, you name it, everything and everything in between. And everybody who's come has been able to do the work that I teach, right? And there's a reason for that because I'm teaching as best as I can, right? Nobody can be Joe or Clara or Ramana, or whoever your teacher was that taught with whoever, or Corolla or Kathy Grant or, Lolita, anybody, you just can't, you're not going to be them. You have to be your own teacher. So to become an expert, you're going to have to take what you're able to find and integrate that in a way that, in your body, but it doesn't mean that you have to have a certain body type. And and another thing is, it's like, Do you have to do Pilates to be an expert at Pilates, teaching wise? And again, that's a fine line. And I think the training that we do, you need to practice it. That's part of it, because if you have it in your body, it's much easier to then pass on the understanding of that movement and that understanding of that function to other people. And especially if you're going to be a really good teacher, which means that you don't teach the way you learn, you teach the way each individual that you're teaching learns, which is and that's a wide variety and variability in understanding how to do that. And that, again, that's what makes an expert to me. It's not just being able to verbatim and say, here's an exercise, here's the system, here's what I've done, this is how I was taught, so I'm going to teach you that way. It's not necessarily that at all, right? But that's part, well, I don't want to, there's some of that in there, right? But it's really about how do you put it all together and make it, an understanding teaching in that level. So again, as an expert, because I think that the question was related to teaching, not necessarily just an expert, because there's in my little promo for today, there's the people who that try to be an expert in the history or in the science or in all these variables. But what I see most of the time, not most of the time, but often, I've seen a few people who really do the work, and I see a lot of people who then take that work and then redo it and then try to say, oh, well, I'm an expert too. And they just, they don't have that foundational understanding. When I was a I'm still a physical therapist, but when I was in my early years, I did a lot of continuing education. I'd spend about $10,000 a year going, and that was, 30 years ago, so that was a lot more money than today, right? Or value-wise. Anyways, and I would, when I started to do these continuing education courses, I learned very quickly that there was a lot of people doing that. You'd get this course, and I'd find out that they learned it from somebody else who learned it from somebody else, and sometimes even learned it from somebody else. So what I started to do is I started to look for the source of that information. Who started teaching that first? Who started that technique? Where did that technique come from? Where did that methodology come from? Where's the foundation? Where is the original? Where does it come from? Right, the source. So I always look for the source, and that's when I went to Pilates, that's what I did as well, because I didn't go to teachers that did were second generation or first generation that had their own methods, right? And there's quite a few. The Eve Gentry method, the Ron Fletcher method. They took Joe's work and they added a bunch of other stuff to it. And Kathy Grant, she added all her stuff. They all do that, and we all do that to a certain degree. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily bad. I'm just saying that that's sort of what they did. And, what's interesting, because when their methods and their name and methods didn't take off, they came back and did Pilates. But now they made what they added as Pilates. And they can, because anything's Pilates today, right? So if that's the case, I went and Romana was the one who took over the original Pilates studio. So that's who, and when I found out about it, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to the source. And so that's where I went. And I've been there ever since. And that's why, I call what we do now the Pilates source, because I am the fifth owner of that business, that original business, right? So that's something to think about as well. Anyways, that is a tangent. So now, what else is there that makes somebody an expert, right? Do you have to be able to do the work anytime and still be an expert? Or can you not necessarily do the work, so you get injured, right? How do Pilates teachers get injured? Well, they start teaching all the time and then they don't work out enough, right? And how many of you have been guilty of that? Come on, raise your hand. Most of you have. And that partly is because you're really trying to take care of your clients and stuff. But the other thing is, the best thing about Pilates is you can go away and you can come back and it's still there and it's still in your body if you've been taught well, right? And you've learned it, right? That's learning. That's not just doing, that's learning. And if you learned it, it's always there, unless you have a brain injury. So that's, if that's the case, So if you have an injury and you've been, out of shape, does that mean you can no longer be an expert teacher of Pilates if you've been teaching for 10 or 20 years or 30 years or however long it is, and you have that, knowledge, and then all of a sudden you can't do it? Does that make you no longer an expert because you're out of shape? No, not at all. Those are the things that we have to start to think about when we're looking at that. So if you're looking for an expert, what do you have to look at? The time, what and how they trained, their history, and what kind of what's their background, and that's important. I think the other thing is there's two other aspects to this I think that may be interesting as well. Hey, Tara. Which is, how much do they know of the source, right? Do they go back and really study the foundation of the work, right? And the more that you understand the foundation, the more I think you become, and have the potential and ability to become an expert in that work. If you're always learning all these other things and trying to add it to what you're doing, then, you're an expert in that, but are you the expert in the thing that you're adding it to, right? And excuse me. As a physical therapist, I studied many things. I'm a Feldenkrais practitioner. I studied acupuncture in Asia, Thai massage in Thailand, yoga in India. I've gone and studied a lot of things because I wanted to learn how to take care of the body. I taught anatomy for 24 years in the university. I've done a lot of informational stuff and studying the body in many different ways because I was working with the body. And, most of these systems, they have their horse blinders on and they're focused on that one part of the body. Or you go to another country and they think slightly differently, right? They have a different mindset. And so being able to learn how a different society understands and looks at the body in the way that they think, which is different than the way that you think, allows you to have another screen, another filter to look at the body with. So that can also be, so does your person have a lot of stuff, and what are they trying to do? And if they're mixing it all up all the time, they're an expert in that, but are they an expert in Pilates? And one of the things that I've always done is I've tried to differentiate and separate. In my physical therapy practice, there was always Pilates and physical therapy, but I didn't bring in the physical therapy into Pilates. I did my physical therapy. I did all the modalities and all the techniques and all the things that I did for that person's injury. And then when they were ready for exercise, I put them into Pilates because to me, that's the best system that's available for the general public. And I felt that I've been feeling that way for almost since the very beginning. And I still feel that way. And I haven't seen anything else that beats it. So at least Joe's Pilates, let's put it this way. Joe's Contrology. That the anything goes Pilates today, no, I don't necessarily agree with that. Okay? All right. So that's part of it. Okay? So that's, I think that, again, when it comes to what makes an expert, you have to look at a lot of different levels, and you can be an expert with just one of those things. You can be an expert with a lot of those things, and so it's time, it's practice, it's studying, it's the history, but it's not body type, and it's not the type of what you used to do or do. It's that I don't think that is. It may be helpful to a certain degree, but that's not a requirement, okay? And I think when you're looking at an expert, that's the thing that you want to pay attention to. And again, in my little post for today, I say this all the time. There's a lot of know-it-all, know-nothings. And with social media and with everything that's out there, it's very easy for people to, get hits and do things and show stuff. But does that really mean that they really know what they're talking about? And I can tell you that I have a little bit of knowledge. And when I look at some of the stuff that I see, it's clear that they don't really understand a lot of what they're trying to talk about, at least in my view. And that's mine. You can have your view, I have mine, and that's okay. All right? Because that's part of the process. But at the same time, are you going to then be with an expert, and follow that expert when it doesn't always make sense. Maybe that's up to you. I mean, I don't think that's something that you can define. We always must learn more and more. Well, not everybody does. I know people that I went to physical therapy school that never went and did another continuing education their whole career, right? PT school, I learned it. That was it. I'm done. And I know Pilates teachers, same way. So, and there's all sorts of variables. Now, can they still, over time, if they work with people, become an expert? Of course they can, because they're focused on the work that they do. Right. Okay. Thank you for always. Well, I try. That's part of what I've always done. For ever since I've started, is to share the knowledge. Now I get some. I get kickback. Because sometimes I know a lot. Right. I've studied a lot. I've taught a lot. The things that I've done, and so I put my 2 cents into some of these social media platforms, and I have too much time on my hands. I wish. Anyways, so that's enough. All right, you're welcome. And if you know other people who think that might benefit, have them come and join and DM me if you have a question. DM me messages. I'll do my best to answer them the way I do. It's not like a back and forth because it's Fridays and I have to work. I have to go too, so I got to go to work. It's about 20 minutes or so, somewhere around there. So I don't have time to go back and forth. And, it's dialogue, and you can always DM me and we can do more. All right. So thank you for that. And again, every Tuesday at 12:30, I have my Balanceology, which is not Pilates at all. It's balance work and improving your imbalance. And then at 1 o'clock, I do my arm springs, leg springs based on the resistor poster, but I also add other archival arm spring exercises in that class. And you don't need a resistor. You can have a Cadillac, a guillotine, a wall unit, all those things, right? You can do all that stuff and join in at any time you want. Okay, and that's Tuesdays. All right, and any of the information you can get that off of the Linktree /Sean_Gallagher lists all the things that I'm doing and what I'm doing with myself, what I'm doing with Elaine Ewing. We do a lot of things together. We do webinars. We do a bunch of stuff. And if you know other people who like these kind of dialogue, they can go to the Pilates Source YouTube channel. And I have all these. The playlist is AMAP, Ask Me Anything Pilates. And there's over 40 some AMAP sessions, so they can get lots of answers possibly, or at least a lot of information. All right, well, thanks for joining me, and I will see you all next week. All right, thanks. Bye-bye.